Hello, my name's Adam and welcome to another edition of Gadabout Politics. Today I want to talk about Jonathan Pollard and why Israel should be playing down its master spy's homecoming. Jonathan Pollard, now 66, set foot on Israeli soil for the first time on December the 30th, disembarking a private jet with his wife and fulfilling a dream he'd had for decades. He was met on the tarmac by none other than the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who gave him a very warm welcome. He was soon on his way to a fully furnished Jerusalem apartment, accompanied with tweets from the Diaspora Affairs Minister, the minister in charge of bringing Jews back from all over the world to come and settle in Israel, with the tweet, "How good it is that you are home." In a nutshell, Pollard passed classified secrets to Israel, amounting in the mid-80s, about 84-85, amounting to tens of thousands of pages, betraying the country of his birth, the United States. However, before I begin, I want to put this into a little bit more context, because what I'm going to talk about will seem like Israeli chutzpah, spying on its most consistent ally, but it doesn't always go one way. In 1987, Yosef Amit, an Israeli, was convicted of spying for the US on Israel and served 2/3 of a 12-year sentence before being released. It doesn't carry the same sort of gravity as the case I'm about to discuss regarding Jonathan Pollard. It's just merely an example that friends and allies do spy on each other, which is okay until you get caught. Anyway, back to Pollard, and for context, so you can decide for yourself about his motives, or even if you don't actually know who Pollard is, here is his story. And then I'll give my 2 cents worth as to why I think Israel should have played this down instead of making a whole big thing about it. Pollard is a Texan, born to a Jewish family in 1954. In 1970, he made his first trip to Israel, concocting stories that when he was there that he was actually a Mossad operative at the age of 16, and having attained the rank of colonel in the IDF and having killed an Arab whilst guarding a kibbutz. Further, he claimed his father was a CIA operative who had fled Czechoslovakia during Prague Spring in '68. All of these claims were, as I said, fantasies, and we'll give some context later on with everything else that he's accused of and what he did. Pollard was hired after failing the CIA application process by the Navy Field Operational Intelligence Office. He eventually attained not only top secret clearance but also sensitive compartmented information clearance as well. This is despite Pollard habitually lying about prior drug use when interviewed, his father being a CIA operative now in South Africa, not Czechoslovakia, and having lied about his language and educational skills and achievements respectively. Despite raising a series of red flags for his unorthodox behaviour and the discovery of his habitual lying, he lost his clearance and position, but eventually regained it in October '84 after applying and being accepted to a position as an analyst for the Naval Intelligence Command. Shortly after starting this position, Pollard met Aviem Seller, a combat veteran in the IAF, the Israeli Air Force. Pollard allegedly offered his services voluntarily, claiming that the US intelligence was actually withholding vital intelligence from Israel that was mandatory to her security. Within a few days of Seller's tenure as Pollard's handler, after receiving orders from the his Air Force intelligence commander to recruit him, the steady flow of US classified intelligence began. Pollard started by receiving a $10,000 cash amount, a very nice sum for the '80s, as well as very expensive gems. This led to a steady salary of $2,500 a month, as well as tens of thousands of dollars for hotels, meals, and in jewellery. Pollard at his trial stated that he intended to pay all of this back to the State of Israel and was only doing this for altruistic reasons to protect the Jewish state. However, Pollard admitted later on to shipping his services to other nations, including Pakistan, China, and possibly Iran, at best enemies of the US and Israel. Pollard purposely stole classified US documents related to China in order to be used by his wife to further her business interests. These were discovered by investigating authorities when Pollard was discovered. The US government's investigation team was convinced that many of the documents passed on by Pollard, whilst not receiving remuneration at the time, would be later cashed in for future business opportunities once Pollard had left his position with the Navy. Pollard's misdealings were further exposed at trial when he revealed he'd reportedly disclosed data to an officer from the Australian Royal Navy during an officer exchange. The alarmed Australian officer flagged this shocking behaviour and it went up the chain of command. Pollard evaded capture in '84 when he misplaced a report of Soviet military equipment that was traced to him, but he managed to excuse this behaviour, claiming he was working on terrorist networks. The following year, an anonymous colleague flagged Pollard's unusual behaviour and work patterns of removing documents and not taking them to an appropriate destination, such as other intelligence agencies in the area. This report was not acted upon. Pollard's direct superior had noticed, after coming in on a Saturday, a number of unsecured classified pieces of material. Securing it, Pollard's supervisors started to believe a foreign government could be involved, but from the diverse nature of the unsecured documentation, he couldn't guess which one. The following week, Pollard was stopped by FBI agents as he was removing classified material from his work premises. He explained that he was taking it to another analyst and to a different agency for consultation, but this story was easily debunked. Pollard agreed to a voluntary interview, but he asked if he could call his wife first to tell her where he was. As it was voluntary, the FBI allowed it to take place, and Pollard used the word cactus in the conversation with his wife, a code word that they'd previously agreed on. They were in trouble and she needed to remove all classified material in the home, and she did that with the help of a neighbour. Pollard then agreed to a search of his home, believing that his wife had been thorough enough in her clearing of the apartment. She hadn't. The FBI then passed this back to Pollard's supervisors, who had been the ones who had been suspicious in the first place. Then they wanted to polygraph Pollard instead, though he admitted passing classified documents to foreign governments but omitted the mentioning of Israel. The neighbour who had assisted Pollard's wife, Anne, with the removing of classified documentation became uncomfortable with the 32 kilograms, that's 70 pounds, in a suitcase of material in his home. He then called around the military intelligence community for advice. He then cooperated fully and was never charged. After this partial confession, Pollard was put under surveillance. He and his wife tried to gain asylum in the Israeli embassy in Washington, but they were refused entry. On leaving the embassy, Pollard was arrested by the FBI and was picked up the following day after initially losing her FBI tail. The US government began preparing a multi-count criminal indictment against him, which included drug offences and tax fraud along with espionage. Pollard had tried to broker deals with South Africa, Argentina and Taiwan, and the previous accusations regarding the Pakistanis and Iranian meet. Pollard eventually broke and agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Israel also agreed to cooperate as long as its operatives were not charged, after initially claiming that Pollard was working for a rogue outfit, not under its auspices. Israel, when asked, only returned a few dozen less sensitive documents when actually tens of thousands of documents had got into Israeli hands. Israel had also had to allow seller Pollard's handler to be interviewed after his indictment, or Congress threatened to cut off aid after Israel had originally agreed to fully cooperate, a promise that they didn't keep to. The US government eventually offered Pollard a plea agreement. Pollard was required to plead guilty to one count of conspiracy to deliver national defence information to a foreign government, which carried a maximum prison term of life, and to cooperate fully with the government's ongoing investigation. Also, he agreed not to disseminate any information concerning his crimes or case, or speak publicly about any classified information without first receiving permission from the Director of Naval Intelligence. True to form, Pollard then spoke to one Wolf Blitzer, a Jerusalem Post correspondent at the time, who interviewed Pollard in his cell. Pollard told Blitzer that some of the information he provided the Israelis in a piece called Pollard, Not a Bumbler, but Israel's Master Spy. Some of these details included reconnaissance satellite photography of the PLO's headquarters in Tunisia, which was used for Operation Wooden Leg, the specific capabilities of Libya's air defences, and the pick of the US intelligence about Arab and Islamic conventional and unconventional military activity from Morocco to Pakistan and every country in between. This included both friendly and unfriendly Arab countries. Prosecutor Joseph de Genova presented the Blitzer prison interview as evidence in his sentencing memorandum that Pollard had engaged in unauthorized disclosure of classified information. In his defense, Pollard said the American intelligence establishment collectively endangered Israeli security by withholding crucial information, despite the fact he was not under full disclosure of what the US was passing or not passing to Israel in the form of intelligence. The Pollards then conducted further media interviews to rally the Jewish community supporters in the US, Israel and abroad, as well as proclaiming a moral justification for such actions as Jews and as human beings to help the state of Israel. They pleaded guilty in June 2006, with Pollard stating that his motives, and I quote, may have been well-meaning. They cannot, under any stretch of imagination, excuse or justify the violation of the law, particularly one that involves the trust of government. I broke trust, ruined and brought disgrace to my family. He admitted and apologized for taking money from the Israeli government in exchange for classified information. The prosecution answered these statements by saying that the Pollards had continued to violate a number of non-disclosure agreements even as the trial was taking place, such as the Blitzer interview. Sentenced and imprisoned in March 1987 under the US Espionage Act for illegally passing US secrets to his Israeli handler, who he met by accident in New York several years earlier. He also had the conspiracy to commit espionage. Israel issued from this and a formal apology to the USA for its role in the breach of trust between the Allies. And Pollard was sentenced to 5 years, paroled after 3.5 due to health problems, and subsequently divorced by Pollard in order to release his wife and from any obligations, seeing as Pollard has just been imprisoned for life. Israel made more than a handful of efforts over the next 30 years to do a deal for his release from him moving to Israel. In the following years, there were major campaigns from both the US, Israel, and Europe for his release. Alan Dershowitz called his sentence excessive. The amount of campaigning that was done by senators, congressmen, Israeli politicians, etc. is too numerous to mention on this podcast. He received Israeli citizenship remotely whilst behind bars in 1995. He was granted parole in July 2015, released that November. He had, as part of the restrictions of his parole, the inability to travel abroad, which expired in 2020. The US State Department, probably under orders from President Trump, perhaps a parting gift to Netanyahu and Israel, with whom he had a very good relationship, decided not to renew the parole, and therefore he could leave. So that's it. That's what Pollard did. That's what he was accused of, served time for, and you can draw your own conclusions whether you think he was a hero of Israel, just protecting the Jewish state, which wasn't getting the full picture from its American counterparts at the time in intelligence, or that he was a traitor to his country, or that he served his time now, 25 years plus 5 years parole, and he should be allowed to live his life in peace in the country he chooses if they're willing to accept him, which Israel obviously is. Or if you think he got off too lightly or it was too harsh a sentence, depending on your point of view. But since his imprisonment, and this is my issue, instead of being embarrassed or trying to play it down sensibly like the USS Liberty incident in the Six-Day War, where Israel were let off the hook by President Johnson for attacking and crippling a US naval vessel, Pollard has become a cause célèbre amongst Jewish and Zionist groups as well as the Israeli government itself. However, this incident strained US-Israeli relations for decades, and Pollard himself was denied clemency by no fewer than 5 presidents. He served that full 25 years and 5 years of parole, which could be, that sort of harshness could be due to the fact that there were tons of documents that weren't disclosed at trial that were so severe that it was damaging to the American intelligence community, and it was better to cover that up. And it also didn't do Israel any harm to not broadcast the severity of what Pollard did. But what led to this podcast was, back in November, this call that was shown on Israeli media that Pollard had while still in America with Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. after it was confirmed that Pollard wasn't going to have his 5-year parole renewed by Trump, and in fact he could fulfill his dream and come home to Israel.
Hello? Jonathan? It's very good to hear your voice. Hineni. So when are we going to see you here? We're waiting for you. Wow. Thank you, Jonathan. This is very moving for me to hear that. Thank you, I appreciate it. You should feel comfortable, and you should feel, you should really feel at home, and you should feel comfortable. You should have now a comfortable life where you can pursue, both of you can pursue your interests, and we can take care of Esther in the best medical treatment in the world.
I'm not American, but this is just cringeworthy. Not just as it's a blatant PR stunt from Netanyahu, but that this national embarrassment for Israel-US relations is being welcomed home as if he were Eli Cohen, the Israeli spy who was tortured to death and executed by the Syrian regime, his body still not recovered, and popularised by Sacha Baron Cohen's portrayal of him in Netflix. Whether you think this man was a traitor or a hero, and we know he is not personally, we know he's not personally 100% to blame for his actions, the then Israeli government is also very culpable. This man also lined his and his wife's pockets, made attempts to, and he's, by the way, he's been on the Israeli payroll since about '88. He's been receiving a salary. He also made attempts to sell classified US secrets to Pakistan, China and Iran, who are not only the US's enemies, but also Pakistan and Iran would love to wipe Israel off the face of the map. Given the chance, this was hardly done for Israeli security, as he and his then wife claimed. And then you see the sort of response like this on social media. The lack of understanding about the gravity of his crimes and his purported self-interest overriding that, not only of the nation of his birth but of Israel too, is laughable. Surely I've seen the opposite feelings in the comments too, but it's mainly positive. It's mainly positive emojis and welcome home, have a great life, you're a hero, etc., and all of this nonsense. And also responses to criticism with arguments tainted by conjecture that this wasn't proven, or he wasn't so bad, or other people had lesser sentences. None of us know the full extent and seriousness of Pollard's actions because it's not been disclosed. So to suggest that you know more because you may have read a book about him doesn't detract anyway from the fact that this guy is a traitor to America, Israel's closest ally. Israel should quite rightly have taken him back. That's fine. He shouldn't have to live the rest of his life in America. This is a country that quite rightly despises him in a lot of quarters. And he did great service to Israel. But it should have been done as quietly and as sensitively as possible. Pollard is a national embarrassment in US-Israeli relations, not a success. And no respect has been shown to the nation that has saved Israel's fate on countless occasions over the last 40-45 years due to aid, intelligence, selling of weapons, and being their only consistent friend at the UN. Instead, we got this on the 30th of December. So you've got this homecoming, this piece on Ynet News, and you've got the Pollard's kissing the ground, and welcoming by Netanyahu, but it's the emojis and it's the comments below, overwhelmingly positive, that I find extremely troubling in all of this. So there it is. Pollard is in Israel and everything comes full circle. But this all about me moment for Netanyahu, with yet another election due in 3 months' time, as the Prime Minister's newspaper of choice, Yisrael Hayom, Israel Today, has sole access in covering this event, the welcoming of Israel's most notorious hero, landing by private jet on the 30th of December. So all I have to say is that Israel and Israelis or supporters of Israel, doesn't have to be Israelis, enough Israelis who don't feel like this. I'm not going to generalise the whole population. Have a bit of class, have a bit of respect, feel a bit of shame for the friendship and betrayal of an ally 34 years ago. Have some class and welcome your boy home discreetly. Not have it filmed. Show respect for President Trump, who has been allied very closely with Netanyahu over the last 4 years. This president who facilitated 4 deals with previously unfriendly nations, opening the Middle East to a positive shift in relations that could reap benefit for generations. For me, hopefully this is the last we will hear of Jonathan Pollard. However, if you disagree, feel free to write in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions. And do me the little favour of sharing and subscribing to this channel.